The auction yard buzzed with noise, a mixture of boots grinding dust into the wooden floorboards and voices rising over the clatter of restless animals. Sunlight slanted through the high, broken windows, cutting the shadows into stripes that draped across a line of worn-out creatures tethered in the corner. Horses snorted, mules stamped, and then at the farthest end stood a donkey so thin and awkward he looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own bones. His coat was rough, patches missing, and one ear drooped lower than the other as though it no longer had the strength to stand upright. When the auctioneer's voice rang out to announce him, laughter trickled through the crowd. No one wanted him. He was too small to haul much, too weak to survive long, and too scarred to fetch a price worth mentioning. Men with folded arms shook their heads. Women whispered with amusement at the pitiful sight. The donkey shifted nervously, pulling at the rope as if he could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. His eyes, dark sunken yet strangely alive, moved across the crowd as if pleading, though no one cared to notice. Emily did. She stood near the back, her boots scuffed, her hair tied back hastily, her face pale with the kind of exhaustion that came from years of scraping by. She hadn't planned to buy anything, in truth. She barely had enough money to keep herself afloat. But something in those eyes held her. They weren't the eyes of a creature ready to surrender. They were the eyes of something still clinging, quietly, stubbornly, to the thread of life that others had long dismissed. The auctioneer barked out the opening bid. Silence followed. Someone in the front muttered, "Not worth the rope he's tied with." Another voice chuckled, "That thing belongs in the ground, not here." Emily's fists clenched at her sides. She knew the sting of such words, knew the taste of being dismissed before she had even tried. Her farm had been failing for 2 years. Crops refused to grow the way they once did. Debts circled her like vultures. People in town whispered about her stubbornness, about how she should give up and sell the land her parents had left her. They called her foolish, called her hopeless, called her exactly what they were calling that donkey. Her heart pounded. She told herself it was madness to even consider it. Yet her hand rose, trembling, before she could stop it. $5, she said, her voice clear enough to cut through the laughter. The crowd turned. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the laughter returned, louder, sharper, directed not at the donkey, but at her. The auctioneer raised a brow as though amused. $5. Do I hear 6? No one answered. He shrugged, slammed his gavel, and announced, "Sold." The donkey was hers. Emily felt her cheeks burn under the weight of the stairs, but she lifted her chin. She walked forward, her boots scraping against the boards, and placed her hand on the coarse rope that tethered the animal. The donkey resisted at first, jerking his head, the whites of his eyes flashing with panic. She leaned closer, whispered softly, words she barely understood herself. "It's all right. You're coming home." Dragging him out of that building felt like dragging her own pride across the dirt. Men smirked as she passed. A woman shook her head in pity. One voice called out, "That thing will eat what little you have left." She ignored them, though each word bit at her skin like nettles. Outside, the sun bore down, hot and merciless. Emily led the donkey to the wagon hitched behind her old, rattling truck. Loading him was a struggle. He brayed, planted his hooves, refused to move. Sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't give up. Inch by inch, coax by coax, she managed to guide him aboard. By the time she climbed into the driver's seat, her arms trembled from effort, but her heart thudded with something strange, something that felt dangerously like hope. The drive home was quiet, the creak of the wagon behind her the only reminder of what she had just done. She caught herself glancing in the mirror, watching him shift uneasily, his ears twitching at every bump in the road. He looked fragile, yet there was a stubborn steadiness in the way he braced himself against the jolts. She whispered to the empty cab, "We'll make it through, you and me." At the farm, the reality struck harder. The barn leaned with age, its boards warped and roof patched with tin. The fields stretched brown and weary, offering little promise. She tied the donkey inside a stall that hadn't seen use in months. He stood there trembling, sides heaving, refusing the water she set before him. For a moment, doubt surged through her like a flood. What if they were right? What if she had wasted what little she had left? But then he turned his head. His eyes met hers again, and she swore there was something unspoken there, a spark, faint yet unyielding. She drew a deep breath. "Chance," she murmured, testing the word on her tongue. "That's your name now, because that's what we're giving each other." She stayed with him until dusk, speaking in a low voice, telling him about the farm, about her parents, about the weight of holding on when the world begged her to let go. He didn't move closer, but he didn't shy away either. That was enough for her. As the sky darkened, she stepped outside, leaning against the fence, watching the stars prick the horizon. The quiet stretched long, broken only by the occasional shuffle from inside the barn. Doubts still circled her mind. She had no plan, no certainty, only the fragile tether between herself and a broken animal. Yet, deep inside, she felt the faintest shift. For the first time in months, maybe years, she wasn't entirely alone in her fight. The villagers' voices echoed in her memory, useless, hopeless, foolish. She clenched her fists, then let them fall open. Let them laugh, she thought. They didn't see what she saw. They didn't understand what it meant to believe when belief itself was the only thing left. Emily glanced back at the barn, where Chance stood hidden in the shadows. She knew nothing about what tomorrow would bring. She only knew this. The moment she raised her hand at the auction, something had changed. Not just for the donkey. For her. The night settled in, carrying with it a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like possibility. And though she couldn't explain why, Emily found herself smiling as she whispered into the darkness, "One step at a time, Chance. We'll prove them wrong." Morning broke with a pale wash of light across the fields, painting the dry earth in muted shades of gold. Emily rose before the sun cleared the horizon, her body weary from restless sleep. She stepped into the barn, the air heavy with the scent of hay and dust. Chance stood rigid in the shadows, his ears twitching, his ribs stark beneath his rough coat. He eyed her warily, as though unsure whether she had truly meant to bring him here, or whether this was just another stop before rejection. She set a bucket of water before him. He sniffed, pawed once at the ground, and turned his head away. Her chest tightened, though she forced herself to speak gently. "You'll drink when you're ready." She laid out a handful of oats, but he ignored them too. Frustration pressed against her patience, but she swallowed it down. She had known from the beginning this would not be easy. She leaned against the stall door watching him breathe and realized that patience would have to become her strength if either of them was to survive. The day stretched long with work. Emily repaired fences and checked the brittle soil, all the while glancing toward the barn. Chance did little more than stand, shifting occasionally, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. By evening, though, she noticed something small. The oats had been disturbed, a faint scatter across the stall floor. Her lips curved into a tired smile. Progress, however slight. Days turned to a rhythm. She rose early, offered water, set out feed, spoke softly in the dim barn light. Chance ignored her more often than not, but occasionally, when she thought he wouldn't, he would flick an ear toward her voice. That single motion, subtle and fleeting, was enough to keep her going. At night, when the loneliness pressed heavy, she sat outside the stall, speaking as though he were a confidant. She told him about her parents, how they had dreamed of making the farm flourish. She told him about her debts, her doubts, her fear of losing everything. Chance said nothing, did nothing, yet the steadiness of his presence kept her words from dissolving into emptiness. One afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning. Clouds stacked heavy and black, and wind ripped through the valley. Emily rushed to gather tools left in the yard, the first drops stinging her skin. A sudden crack of thunder sent Chance into a frenzy. His bray cut through the roar of the wind, sharp and panicked. She ran into the barn, hard hammering, to find him thrashing against the rope, his eyes wild. "Easy," she shouted over the thunder. She reached for him, but he jerked back, nearly toppling himself. The walls rattled, rain hammered the roof, and for a moment she feared he would injure himself. Then, with a sudden burst, he bolted forward, snapping the rope free. Emily stumbled after him into the storm. Through the sheets of rain, she glimpsed his dark shape moving fast toward the far field. She chased, mud sucking at her boots, her breath tearing at her lungs. He ran not aimlessly, but with uncanny certainty, cutting across the field and slipping into a narrow hollow where the wind broke and the rain eased. Emily stumbled in after him, gasping, soaked through, and only then realized what he had done. He had found shelter. Not panic, not madness, instinct. She leaned against the earth wall of the hollow, her chest heaving, water dripping from her hair. Chance stood nearby, sides quivering, eyes still wide but no longer wild. She whispered between breaths, "You knew. You knew where to go." For the first time, she felt something shift, something that made her believe he was not useless at all. He had led her to safety, not the other way around. From that day forward, she looked at him differently. He wasn't broken, just misunderstood. His strengths were buried beneath scars and mistrust, waiting for someone stubborn enough to see them. She began guiding him gently outside the barn, coaxing him step by step. At first, he balked at every sound. A snapped twig, a barking dog, even the whisper of wind sent him retreating. But she persisted, leading him with a steady hand, offering calm words when fear seized him. Each step he took felt like a victory, no matter how small. Weeks passed, and the bond between them deepened. Emily brushed his coat each evening, the coarse hair softening under her care. The first time he allowed her to run the brush along his neck without flinching, her throat tightened with emotion. She whispered, "You're learning to trust me. And I'm learning too." One morning, as she struggled to haul a sack of feed across the yard, Chance followed, unbidden. She glanced over her shoulder, surprised. He nosed at the bag, nudging it as if to help. She laughed, the sound strange in her own ears after so much silence. "All right," she said. "If you want to work, let's try together." Training became their shared language. She tied lighter loads to his back, walking beside him, guiding, encouraging. At first he staggered, his legs uncertain. But slowly, steadily, his stride grew sure. He carried burdens with a quiet resilience, never fast, never graceful, but with a persistence that mirrored her own. Each evening, she collapsed into bed, aching yet filled with a growing belief that they were building something neither of them could manage alone. The neighbors noticed. One morning, while Emily walked Chance along the dirt road, Mr. Harris, the old rancher who lived at the edge of town, leaned on his gate and watched. His eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, followed the donkey with interest. "You're still at it," he said. Emily tightened her grip on the lead rope. "Still at it. Most folks would have given up weeks ago." "I'm not most folks." He chuckled, though his gaze softened. "That animal's got more to him than meets the eye. Donkeys aren't useless. They're patient. They endure. Might teach you something about yourself if you let him." His words stayed with her long after she had walked on. She repeated them to herself at night, when exhaustion made her wonder if she was fooling herself. Chance endured, and so would she. But progress was never straight. One evening, after weeks of steady training, she tried hitching him to a small cart. At first, he pulled willingly, his hooves striking the ground in rhythm. Then a sharp bang echoed from a nearby road, a dropped tool, harmless yet loud. Chance panicked, bolting sideways, the cart jerking violently. Emily rushed to calm him, but the cart tipped, spilling supplies across the ground. He collapsed in the dirt, trembling, as though the world had turned hostile all over again. Emily fell to her knees beside him, tears stinging her eyes. "I thought we were past this," she whispered. She pressed her hand against his heaving side, the weight of defeat heavy on her shoulders. The echoes of laughter from the auction house, from the villagers, came rushing back. Maybe they had been right. Maybe she had clung to a dream destined to break her. But as she knelt there, Chance lifted his head. His dark eyes met hers, uncertain yet steady, as if asking her not to give up. She closed her eyes, let the tears fall, then breathed deeply. "No," she murmured. "Not this time. You're not useless, and neither am I." That night, she sat longer than usual in the barn, stroking his neck, whispering promises she wasn't sure how to keep. Yet with every word, she felt a quiet determination take root, fragile but unshakable. They had stumbled, but the journey wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. The summer heat pressed down on the valley, turning the soil hard and brittle under Emily's boots. Each morning, she walked Chance out along the dusty road, his hooves stirring small clouds with every step. The rhythm of their days had steadied into something that felt almost reliable, though doubts still lingered at the edges of her thoughts. She couldn't ignore the stares from passing neighbors, the quiet shake of their heads, but she also couldn't ignore how much her donkey had changed. His coat had grown shinier beneath her careful brushing, his ribs less pronounced, and there was a sturdiness in the way he carried himself now. One morning, she strapped 2 sacks of grain onto the small cart and held her breath as she clicked her tongue. Chance shifted, braced himself, and began to pull. Slowly at first, then with a steady determination that sent relief flooding through her chest. She walked beside him, watching the muscles in his shoulders move beneath his rough coat. He wasn't fast, but he was steady, and each step was deliberate, as though he had decided that this was a task worth doing. When they reached the far end of the field, Emily leaned against the fence, her heart pounding with pride. "You did it," she whispered, rubbing the rough line of his jaw. "You really did it." Word spread quickly. A few villagers, curious about the progress of the donkey everyone had once laughed at, came by to watch. They stood near the fence, their skepticism giving way to surprise as Chance pulled the cart without faltering. One man muttered, "Didn't think the beast had it in him." Another shrugged, though his eyes betrayed grudging respect. Emily kept her focus on the donkey, unwilling to let their words, praise or doubt, steal this moment from her. For the first time in months, she felt the warmth of hope not as a fleeting spark, but as a steady flame. Later that week, Mr. Harris stopped by again, leaning heavily on his cane, as he watched Chance from beneath the brim of his hat. "Strong back," he said quietly. "Not quick, but strong. You've done well to bring it out of him." Emily flushed at the praise, unsure what to say. Harris continued, "Patience builds trust. Trust builds endurance. That's what wins in the long run, not speed." His words stayed with her as she worked each day, a reminder that progress was not measured in leaps, but in steady steps. It was in the small town square that Emily first heard of the regional farming contest. Flyers tacked to the notice board fluttered in the breeze, promising prize money large enough to erase some of her debts. The contest was a test of strength and endurance, hauling supplies across rugged terrain. Horses and oxen usually dominated the event, their size and power unmatched. Emily stood staring at the flyer, her heart pounding. With that money, she could repair the barn, buy better seed, maybe even secure the future she had nearly lost. But the idea of entering Chance seemed absurd. She imagined the laughter, the ridicule, the way people would point and call her foolish all over again. That evening, she sat outside the barn, staring at the flyer in her hands. Chance chewed quietly on hay behind her, his ears flicking at every sound. She whispered almost to herself, "They'd laugh us out before we even began." The donkey raised his head, watching her with those steady, dark eyes that had first caught her at the auction. Something in his gaze held her, as if he were asking her to believe just a little more. She folded the flyer carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Her decision became harder a few days later when a man in a crisp suit drove up the dirt road to her farm. He introduced himself as Mr. Rowe, a businessman from a city, and wasted no time explaining why he was there. "Your land isn't producing," he said smoothly, "but it's in a prime spot for development. I'll make you an offer, cash immediate, enough for you to start over somewhere else." His eyes swept over the tired barn, the withered fields, and finally the donkey standing nearby. His smirk was sharp, "Especially before you waste more of your time on that useless animal." Emily's stomach nodded. The offer was tempting, more money than she'd seen in years, more security than her failing farm promised. But the word useless burned through her like fire. She glanced at Chance, who stood steady and unbothered by the stranger's presence. Memories of the storm, of his quiet resilience, of every small victory flashed through her mind. She straightened her back. "The farm's not for sale," she said firmly. Rowe's smile thinned, but he tipped his hat and left, his parting words lingering like poison. "You'll regret." The refusal gave Emily strength, but it also sharpened her fear. She doubled down on training, pushing both herself and Chance harder. They rose before dawn, practiced pulling heavier loads, walked longer distances. Progress was slow, uneven, but real. Her muscles ached, her hands blistered, but each evening she looked at Chance and saw the same quiet determination mirrored in his stance. Together, they were preparing for something bigger, even if she hadn't yet said the words aloud. But the path forward was never smooth. One afternoon, as they trained along the rocky edge of the field, a truck backfired on the nearby road. The sharp sound split the air like a gunshot. Chance froze, then bolted, jerking the cart violently. Emily shouted, running to steady him, but the load tipped, spilling across the ground. The donkey stumbled, crashing to his knees. Panic seized her as she rushed to his side. His leg was scraped, blood staining the dust. He trembled, chest heaving, eyes wide with terror. Emily knelt beside him, tears threatening. "It's all right, you're safe," she whispered, though her voice cracked. She pressed her hand against his trembling neck, feeling the hot pulse beneath his skin. The fear in his eyes cut into her, a reminder that trust was fragile, that progress could shatter in an instant. She worked for hours to calm him, to clean the wound, to remind him he wasn't alone. That night, exhaustion pulled her into restless sleep, haunted by the image of him collapsing under the weight of her hopes. In the days that followed, she questioned everything. The contest loomed closer, yet Chance's limp was a reminder of how fragile their progress truly was. Neighbors shook their heads, murmured that she was risking too much, that the donkey wasn't made for such trials. Doubt gnawed at her, whispering that perhaps Roe had been right, that perhaps she was clinging to a dream destined to fail. But every evening, when Chance lowered his head to nuzzle gently against her shoulder, something inside her refused to let go. On the eve of the contest, Emily stood in the barn, the flyer in her hand once more. Chance rested quietly in his stall, his eyes half closed, his breathing steady. She whispered into the dim light, "We're not ready. But maybe we don't need to be. Maybe we just need to try." She pressed her forehead against his and felt his warm breath fan against her cheek. In that moment, the laughter of the villagers, the doubts of the world, even the wound on his leg, all of it faded. What remained was the bond they had forged, fragile but unbreakable. The decision settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. Tomorrow they would stand before the world, mocked perhaps, doubted certainly, but together nonetheless. And for the first time, Emily felt that trying was no longer about winning or losing. It was about proving to them, to herself, and to Chance, that neither of them had been useless all along. Dawn crept across the valley, spreading a pale gold light over the fields as Emily tightened the worn leather strap around Chance's halter. Her fingers trembled, though she tried to steady them, whispering words of encouragement as though the donkey could sense the fear fluttering in her chest. He shifted quietly, ears twitching, his dark eyes watching her with that steady gaze she had come to know so well. Today was the day of the contest. Today they would stand before the same kind of crowd that had once laughed at them both, and either they would prove everyone wrong, or they would fail with nothing left to give. The town square buzzed with life when she arrived, a sea of wagons, animals, and people crowding the packed earth. Horses stamped their hooves, tall and powerful, their manes brushed until they gleamed. Oxen snorted, massive shoulders rippling with muscle. Emily guided Chance through the throng, feeling the weight of eyes settling on her from every side. Whispers stirred, rising into laughter as people recognized the small, scarred donkey at her side. "She brought that thing," someone scoffed. Another voice, sharp with ridicule, "Does she think it's a petting zoo?" The sound pressed in on her, but she kept her chin high, her hand steady on the lead rope. The announcer's voice rang out over the crowd, calling the contestants to line up. Emily walked Chance into position beside towering horses and oxen, their shadows dwarfing him. For a heartbeat, fear threatened to drown her resolve. But then Chance flicked his ear, brushed his nose against her sleeve, and she felt the fragile thread of courage pull taut inside her. She bent close, whispering, "We do this together. One step at a time." The first trial began, a heavy cart laden with sacks of grain to be hauled across the square to the far gate. Horses lunged forward, hooves striking the ground, muscles straining as carts jolted into motion. The crowd cheered, the air thick with dust and noise. Emily swallowed hard, glanced at Chance, and gave the signal. He stepped forward slowly, steady as stone. The cart creaked, shifted, then rolled. The laughter of the crowd grew louder at his sluggish pace, yet Emily's eyes never left him. "That's it," she murmured. "Don't listen to them. Just keep moving." The horses thundered ahead, reaching the gate in bursts of speed, while Chance plodded carefully, his pace unchanging. By the time they reached the finish, the other animals had already completed their run. The crowd jeered, though a few voices grew quiet, watching the donkey's steady determination. Emily brushed his mane, whispering praise, and led him to the next stage. The second challenge was harder, hauling firewood across uneven ground, the path littered with rocks and shallow ditches. One by one, animals stumbled, carts tipping, handlers shouting. Emily's pulse raced as she hooked Chance to the load, fear gripping her throat. She gave the signal, and he pulled forward, cautious but unwavering. His small hooves found solid ground where heavier animals slipped. When the cart wobbled over a ditch, Chance slowed, adjusted, then pressed forward again. The crowd's laughter faltered, replaced by murmurs of surprise. Step by step he reached the end of the course without faltering. Emily's chest swelled with pride, tears prickling her eyes. For the first time, she saw people leaning forward, not to mock, but to watch. Then came the final trial, the true test of endurance, hauling a load of stone across the long, winding road out of town and up the hillside to the old quarry. The sun burned high overhead, heat shimmering off the dirt road. Sweat slicked Emily's palms as she secured the harness. Around them, horses and oxen shifted restlessly, their handlers shouting encouragement. She crouched beside Chance, pressing her forehead briefly against his. This is it. No matter what happens, you've already shown them more than they ever expected. But if you've got anything left, give it to me now. The whistle blew, and the animals surged forward. Dust rose in clouds as hooves pounded the earth. Chance braced himself, leaned into the harness, and began his slow climb. The stones weighed heavy, the cart groaning behind him, but he didn't falter. Emily walked beside him, every step matched with a whispered word of encouragement. Steady. One more step. You can do this. Halfway up the hill, chaos broke out. A horse stumbled, collapsing in the dust, its handler rushing to free it from the harness. Another animal bolted, cart careening into the ditch. The once roaring crowd grew restless, some shouting in alarm, others murmuring in disbelief. Through it all, Chance kept moving, his pace unbroken, his breaths heavy but even. Emily's throat ached with pride, her legs trembling as she kept stride. That's it, she whispered. Show them who you are. By the time they neared the summit, the field had thinned. The great beasts who had started with such speed were spent, their sides heaving, their eyes rolling with exhaustion. Chance, though weary, pressed on, each step carrying him closer. The crowd, once dismissive, now roared with growing astonishment. They leaned over fences, shouting encouragement, voices rising in waves that carried up the hill. Emily barely heard them. Her focus was on the donkey beside her, the steady rhythm of his hooves, the fire in his dark eyes. At the crest of the hill, the cart rolled to a stop. Emily collapsed against the wooden frame, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Chance stood panting, sides heaving, but his stance was unbroken, his head lifted proudly. For a long moment, silence fell across the hillside. Then, as if a dam had broken, cheers erupted from the crowd below. They shouted his name, though most had never spoken it before. Chance! Chance! Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, sobbing into his coarse mane. You did it, she whispered, her voice shaking. You proved them all wrong. When the officials tallied the results, disbelief rippled through the square. Despite his slow start, Chance's steady pace and flawless endurance had earned him the highest score. Emily's knees nearly buckled as they announced her as the winner, the prize money enough to wipe out her debts and breathe life back into the farm. The same people who had once laughed now pressed forward with praise, their voices loud and eager. But Emily's attention remained fixed on the donkey at her side, the one everyone had called useless. Later, as dusk settled and the crowd dispersed, Emily walked Chance back toward the quiet road leading home. The prize money lay folded in her pocket, heavy with promise, but was nothing compared to the weight of what they had accomplished. She stopped at the edge of the field, watching the sky blaze orange and pink, and laid a hand against his neck. Everyone thought you had nothing to give, but you carried me farther than I ever dreamed. Chance flicked his ear, nuzzling her shoulder with gentle insistence. She smiled through her tears, her voice steady now. We're not done, you and me. This is only the beginning. The farm no longer felt like a burden as they returned, but like a place reborn. The laughter of doubters no longer haunted her. Instead, the memory of cheers echoed in her heart. She knew hardships would return, challenges would come again, but she also knew she would never face them alone. Together, they had turned rejection into triumph, weakness into strength, despair into hope. And as the stars blinked awake across the darkening sky, Emily whispered into the night, words meant not just for Chance, but for anyone who had ever been told they were worthless. Sometimes the world only sees failure. But sometimes that's where miracles begin. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.